This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
This is Jordan Burris with SoCure.
Today, we're going to talk about identity verification and federal security. Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Our guest today is Jordan Burris, Vice President and Head of Public Sector Strategy at a company called SoCure, S-O-C-U-R-E. But first, before we begin the interview, I would be remiss if I did not mention that we are recording this at the Caboose Brewery in lovely downtown Vienna, Virginia. Why here? Well, Vienna, Virginia is surrounded by tech companies. What better place to talk about identity verification for the federal government? Well, let's jump right in here quickly, Jordan. I said the name of your company, SoCure, S-O-C-U-R-E. There may be some listeners that don't know much about your company. Give us a thumbnail sketch of where you're based and how you got started.
Yeah, no, fantastic, and appreciate you having me back on the podcast, John. So SoCure is a company that specializes in really helping confirm that someone who's presenting themselves online, that they are who they claim to be ultimately, right? We're solely focused on identity verification and fraud risk management, and what makes us special is our ability to look holistically at someone's online digital footprint, if you will, and be able to determine that they are indeed that the right individual at the time that they are engaging with an online digital service.
Well, I normally quote famous philosophers like Yogi Berra, but today I'm going to quote someone different. And here's the quote, and this tosses right to the discussion today. Governments are still in the 19th century in terms of some of their approaches, systems, and how they handle identity. This is a quote from Lydia Payne Johnson, Senior Fellow, Center for Digital Government. Boy, that's an attack, isn't it? Look at the 19th century. Come on now.
Well, I think it really speaks to the fact that technology has always been the last thing to be updated within a number of government agencies, right? There's a lot of competing priorities, and unfortunately, when we're looking at the state of technology today, there's many instances where it's just fallen behind into a state of decay, which is leading us to the point where it's harder to promote digital services that work for everyone.
If you went to Google and typed in executive orders on user experience, you'd get all kinds of different things come up. I downloaded a few this morning. And so I think one part of user experience is identifying yourself to be able to access services. And I guess when I think of services from the federal government, I really can't really detail them, except if you go to SoCure.com and read your blog, you'll find out that, John, wise up. People all over the country are accessing public services, financial services, employment services, economic funding, lots and lots of services have to be acquired from the federal government. And if the goal is to improve the customer experience, then identification is really the start, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about it, the government broadly, right, not just federal government, but state and local government as well, is central to everything that we have to do across American society. If you're thinking about going to the DMV, if you're thinking about applying for food benefits, those who were impacted by the pandemic and had to apply for unemployment insurance, all of them sought the government in their time of need. Those who are at the tail end of their career and looking at retirement, maybe drawing on Social Security in particular, all of these are services that the government offers and renders at the end of the day. And with what we saw during the course of the pandemic, a lot of them had to shift towards a digital channel in order to operate. And so there's really this now renaissance, if you will, in the view of like what current government services that we have today and whether or not they need to evolve in order to better meet the needs of the American people.
In a recent article written by Jordan Burris, it's titled, White House Recognizes Digital Identity as a Top Priority. And you had me with the first sentence when you talked about pandemic anti-fraud measures. Millions of dollars were lost over COVID through false representations here. And so this, I think for most humans, you hit them with the money first and then tell them the rest of the story. So this is really, it's the money story, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there's been a number of attempts, I'll say, to hone in on digital identity, even going back to the Obama administration. And what we've seen recently from the Biden-Harris administration has been two documents that signal really the focus of what they want agencies to be working on. One, the National National Cybersecurity Strategy highlighted digital identity and really the need to create a better ecosystem for identity overall, strengthen things such as helping us get away from phishing phishable credentials or authenticators at the end of the day, but also looking at digital identity and how that is promulgated and put together. And then additionally, the president has signaled for 2 years now what would be kind of a forthcoming executive order related to identity and benefits or fraud prevention rather in benefits. And as part of that, he also signaled funding or targets for the administration related to funding. Some of this was highlighted in the president's budget, but then also existing funding that was allocated by Congress through things like the American Rescue Plan, where they were highlighting that for states in particular, funding would be made available to help modernize a lot of their technology, much to the earlier point of, those who were stuck in the 19th century, giving them kind of the incentive and the ability to change their status quo.
I like to use big fancy words to impress people, and I want to limit myself to a couple fancy words here. One is called identity verification and identity authentication. Mm-hmm. So maybe concur and contrast these two for our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of folks are familiar with the authentication piece, and I'm going to start with that one first, right? The authentication piece is usually when you show up at a website and you have to enter in in some cases, your username and password, or for those of us who are getting away from that, maybe you're using your phone and it's sending you like a one-time passcode or things along those lines. The idea here being is that you're authenticating, that you're almost confirming that you are the right person at the end of the day. But even before you get to that process, there's this piece called enrollment or registration, that piece where someone has to be onboarded to the system or the service in particular. Identity verification comes into play there, and it's about confirming ultimately that it is a real person that they're engaging with, ultimately, even before they're assigned or they assign themselves a password or some type of authenticator. Ultimately, these two concepts go hand in hand, and they're honestly essential for operating in any digital service today.
So verification is a one-time event, and authentication may be ongoing, huh?
Yeah, so authentication absolutely would be an ongoing thing. Verification doesn't have to be a one-time event, so it's actually funny. A lot of it today, and the way it's rolled out across a number of organizations, they treat it as once you've done it, you don't need to do it again. The reality is that our footprint changes. How do I confirm after 20 years that the same person who's using the username and password is still, the Jordan Burris or the John Gilroy that originally created the account and onboarded? And so there's actually ways in which you can do what is more progressive profiling, or the idea is to progressively identify or verify someone over time. This can be what we call reproofing events, where we're basically asking them to reconfirm that they are the right individual, or we're able to evaluate pieces of their identity over time as they change. Take, for an example, for me, when I was coming out of high school, I had a very bad, and I'm not going to name it here, email address in particular. It just was completely weird. It showed how much of a nerd I was, and it very much changed it to one that more reflected, I would say, more of a corporate sense, or at least that's what my counselors at college told me way back when, and it had more of my first name and last name. And that, in particular, that change in and of itself can trigger what would be a reproofing event, because you want to confirm that ultimately that the information that is being asserted is linked to an individual.
My last interview, we did a deep dive on artificial intelligence, and what I first did is I went to Google Trends, and people have been talking about artificial intelligence for a long time.
Absolutely.
And so, for your benefit, I went to Google Trends again, and I typed in identity verification, and I contrasted it with identity authentication. Now, what's interesting is both terms have been around for a while. Back in 2004, they're about equal in searches on Google. Now what's happened is identity verification has gotten much and much, much more important. And so it looks like you're either lucky or kind of sliding in the right spot here, huh?
Well, it's funny enough. So I even go back to, and I may have said this previously, but back when I used to work in government, right, back in the 2018-2019 time frame, for those of you who like to go look at old presidents' budgets, there was
there's a hobby.
There was there was an initiative that we started around modernizing identity proofing, modernizing the way in which we are able to verify individuals. Why? Because we saw on the horizon that there was going to be events of fraud. We saw the need for digital services were going to increase, and we also understood that due to all the numerous breaches that occur day in and day out, that the current model that has been used largely, which is a credit system-based model, no longer worked. Fast forward to the pandemic, unfortunately nothing changed, and that's what led to what we saw in some cases, a lot of rampant fraud across a number of organizations. And so when you're seeing the spike now, the talk about identity verification, there's been this realization, this aha moment, especially as folks are now stepping first into digital services and understanding what that is, that we can't necessarily rely on the premise that I can always show up in person and present some form of government ID and confirm who I am. Perhaps there is a situation where, like we experienced in the pandemic, someone is going to be at home, they're going to be remote, they're not going to be able to show up in person, and as such, we need to have confidence that they are ultimately the right individual for receiving the service.
I'm not going to quote Yogi Berra. We'll quote Dolly Parton. I think she said, "I was country before country was cool." So before authentication was cool, it was so secure. Well, speaking of quotes, I have a quote now. This is the part of the show where I read a quote, and you have to identify the person that said it out of all the billions of people on the planet. This is going to be a tough one. So here's the quote. Digital identity is critical infrastructure. Wait a minute. I thought it was like the power system. I thought it was maybe, really? Digital identity is critical infrastructure? Why do you say that?
It's so funny because, it's actually something I was saying for a number of years, and myself and my business partner, Matt Thompson, we basically kind of honed in on the fact it needs to be there. So look, for us, we may be familiar with financial services or the water or electric grid being critical infrastructure in particular. But it's funny that CISA at one point in time, so the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, named identity functions or identity-related functions as part of their national essential functions list. Basically things that are deemed so critical for operation that their disruption would dismantle or harm, if you will, the ability for us to function as a society. From our standpoint, especially as what we witnessed as really was a holistic digital transformation across the United States, that identity has to be considered critical infrastructure, and the infrastructure, the things that underlie being able to set up those services must be prioritized, because if you get that wrong, that's when you hear stories of people being locked out of benefits, people not being able to engage in the way that they want, people who've already been in underserved and marginalized communities continue to be underserved at the end of the day. And so for us, it is kind of like this battle cry where we really need to put the focus on the fact that identity must be considered critical for us.
It may surprise you, Jordan, but I've written hundreds of headlines for the Washington Post. I had a regular column there for many years. And when you think of a headline, you want to put the headline is millions lost through fraud, tax money, millions lost of tax money. That's what you don't want to talk about. There are people who maybe deserve money from the federal government that aren't claiming it.
Right.
Now, that may be the sub-headline, but I think maybe from an ethical or moral, maybe that should be the headline, but that's not going to sell newspapers. So I want to go to maybe Section D, page 15 of there are people, there may be veterans who are deserving of help from the federal government, and maybe poor identification is prohibiting them from getting that benefit, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been this, a lot of the Pareto principle has been applied to the way in which we've provided services to the government, right? And a lot of it is around kind of the belief that you can cover through 80% of the use cases, you can meet the majority ultimately, right? There's always going to be the outlier, the 20% that falls out of whatever the process or the service is ultimately. Unfortunately, when we look at that 20%, those are typically the ones that are going for government services and benefits. In particular, if you're thinking of those who are looking for food assistance or housing assistance, in particular, those who are impacted by the pandemic, those are the ones who are typically left out. And unfortunately, with the antiquated nature in which identity verification has been used or performed today in government, a lot of those folks are still being left out. They already had a tough enough time trying to do it in person in particular, and then when we shifted online, we just further widened the gap, if you will, for their ability to access these services. And so at the core, the heart of everything that we're looking at from a digital service standpoint is the notion that we need to find a way to bring those communities that have largely been left out back into the fold and give everyone who has the desire or opportunity to use an online channel the ability to do so. It is not difficult today in order to do it. It's actually pretty seamless and be able to perform that. And when you get it right, you're able to get upwards of what would be 98% of populations or individuals who are trying to apply for benefit, their ability to get through the process ultimately. When you get it wrong, that's where you hear, you're only able to get 40% of the people through an online channel, and then everyone else had to go in person, right? And that shouldn't be the norm. That's not what we should consider. We don't expect that of any of our commercial services in particular. The same should be held true for those in government.
Well, that's my cue, Socure.com, SOCURE.com, and there's a section on your company's website, and here's the words: equity is central to Socure's mission. That's it.
Yeah.
That's not the sexy headline. That's not going to sell newspapers, but that's exactly what you're talking about. There are individuals out there who maybe have no credit history. There are individuals that are, what do they call them, underbanked or underserved. There are individuals that are the most in need that maybe not even have an ID. I mean, there's your challenge. How do you even reach those people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it's funny with Socure's mission. Our mission overall is to verify 100% of identities in real time and completely eliminate identity fraud. Right, a very audacious goal, but it's the thing that we wake up day in and day out in order to try and execute. When you think about the different types of individuals who are seeking a service, you can, you've mentioned those who were credit thin file or those from underserved communities. You can also have rural communities in particular, right, where if they are unable to prove who they are online, they have to drive 2 to 3 hours in order to show up somewhere in person, in particular. That doesn't work. Or areas where there's low broadband, in particular. So from our standpoint, we're looking at our technology and the ways in which we approach identity in particular in order to bring everyone into the fold, to overcome some of the systemic barriers and hurdles that have been typically associated with identity, well beyond credit files in particular. It even goes into the way in which we search and match against what a real person may be. Do we account for ethnic variations and things like names, right? Those are all things that we may not think right out of the gate to look at, but as a company, we've made it a priority to ensure that we're doing everything we can to bring folks who are otherwise left out of the process into the online fold.
I was just thinking, when I heard of the word unbanked, I think when I was in college, I wasn't unbanked. I was just plain broke.
You and me both.
We were both have that in common. We were unbanked and underbanked and broke.
You and me both. But it's even funny. Before, I think it was mid-20s before I was even able to apply for my first credit card, right? And it's because I didn't really have a good cosigner in order to do it. And every time I tried to apply, the banks would tell me no, things along those lines. I was in a lot of Generation Z is experiencing this now, 18 to 25-year-olds. I was, one of the people who would fall through the cracks. Now, there's options for those folks, right? Typically what you'll see is that they may go to cash-only systems. Well, that further hurts them down the line if they're trying to do something online. They're looking for alternative means, or they just may say, hey, look, these services were never meant for me in particular. Again, that doesn't need to be the case, and it's something that we've been proving for over the last decade in the commercial world, and we're excited about the opportunity to partner with government agencies in order to help them really transform the way in which they deliver digital services today.
Jordan, I know this is Federal Tech Podcast, but in the commercial world where your company's had a lot of success, they work with insurance companies and banks on anti-money laundering operations, on something called Know Your Customer, which is important for retail. And so it might not have much of an impact on our federal audience. However, I think one of the tools that you developed was data coverage. And all of a sudden, if you can develop a system that gives unrivaled data coverage, all of a sudden, now we're talking to govies, okay? And so tell me about that phrase. Your website talks about unrivaled data coverage. What does that mean for our listeners?
Yeah, so when we think about a lot of identity systems or the identity solutions that have been put in place today, I've mentioned credit-based systems in particular, but the reality is that what that means is that they're solely looking at whether or not someone has a credit file and whether or not they have identity information associated with that file in order to confirm that they are the right person at the end of the day. For people who just choose not to engage in the financial system in those traditional methods, they typically will not be featured. Or folks who are newer to the country, for an example. The way in which Secure approaches it, we actually look and, if you will, scour the ends of the earth for diverse data sources that allow us to encapsulate and identify parts of the population who otherwise would be left out of these channels. This is what allows us to be more accurate when we're looking at the younger population. This is what allows us to be more accurate when we're looking at those who are newer to the country and they're just recently stepping foot within the U.S. and confirming that they have the same experience ultimately that someone who has been in the country for 40, 50 years has at the end of the day, and they're not put into a different category and say that the only way in which you can engage is if you go in person and you jump through these 4 or 5 hoops, right? Like our goal is to basically find the types of data that allows us to better triangulate on identity overall, but then also give us signal into understanding the patterns associated with fraud, so that way we can combat really what is happening from nation-state and criminal ring-driven attacks on public benefits.
Secure been in business since 2012, over 1,000 commercial customers, working with many federal agencies. What they say on your website, again, is that 100% identity verify in real time. So having the database there ain't good enough. You have to be able to work with people quickly so they don't, for example, if a person deserves benefits, goes online, they could abandon if it's not fast enough. I mean, This is what humans are like,
Yep.
Google says if your go-to website takes more than 3 seconds to load, you're going to bomb. What if you're waiting 10 minutes for identity verification? So you got to be 350 pounds and you got to have a 4440. Now wait a minute, really?
Yep. No, and it's true. I mean, so our research has shown, but then also if you look at other research that's out there, is that you see upwards of 50% abandonment rates for folks who are exhibiting some sort of friction as part of a process with engaging with an online service. It shouldn't take days, weeks, months, or even years in order to confirm who someone is. That should be the seamless part of the process. And you should have a high level of assurance at the end of the day that it is the right individual, right? It's looking at identity as a math problem, right? And that's effectively what we've tried to boil it down to with our approach as a company. And if you get it right, then you're able to have quick performance. For us, we're, again, in less than a second, able to confirm who someone is when they're engaging online and do it with a high degree of accuracy.
Back to our headlines. I thought this is going to focus on the National Cybersecurity Strategy and their emphasis on supporting a digital identity ecosystem. And it could, but maybe I should put a different hat on you, and your hat is user experience hat. And so, it's fine to be safe, but, I think you also have to, the 5 skill in baseball, huh? And so I think that's what's interesting about your company is that it's almost crossing over in those both areas, and you have to do both well. I think that's the challenge, because maybe a company can do one well or the other, but doing both at the same time, especially with all the restraints the federal government's website has, it's got to be a real challenge for your company.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a false belief for a long period of time that in order to improve customer experience, generally you had to, make security more lax. Ultimately, at the end of the day, that's not reality. You can do both at the same time. You can deliver a great customer experience, and you can make sure that it is the right individual, that you're securely asserting individual's identity. What it takes is an understanding and renewed focus for evaluating what an identity is. It takes taking more of a data-driven approach to doing, or analytical approach for looking at identity, and it's something that we've been able to prove, fortunately, year after year. Across a number of industries, and it's one of the reasons why we worked to pull together what is a playbook, really, for organizations that are looking to understand what it is to set up a digital identity program. Digital Identity 101, we labeled it for state CIOs, CISOs, and CTOs. But the idea here being is that ultimately at the end of the day, there's a lot of things that have been thrown at them. And again, as a former civil servant, I understand there's a lot of priorities, a lot of things that they have to consider. And so with that, what could we put out there that allowed us to better showcase the foundation, the building blocks, if you will, for getting these programs stood up and getting them stood up in a manner that allows us to promote transparency, promote accountability, speed, security, so on and so forth.
Okay, we've got to end the interview here. I think I have a 5-word headline. Here it is. Accurate and inclusive digital identity verification. Maybe that covers them all, huh?
That is it.
You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Jordan Burris, Vice President and Head of Public Sector Strategy at Socure.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.